Well, we've heard the account again of exactly what happened when Jesus was crucified. And as I thought about what to say, I simply entitled this sermon, Crucified God. And that's what happened. God was crucified. I want to talk to you a little bit about, some of you familiar with the term butterfly effect? A butterfly effect is used to describe when something maybe very small and seems insignificant can have a huge effect somewhere around the world much, much later. In other words, butterfly effects helps us think about how connected things are. So the example used in a butterfly effect is maybe a butterfly flaps its wings, and 3 months later there's a tornado 100 miles away. Maybe that little bit of puff of wind from the butterfly's wings actually causes some type of ripple effect. And we end up with repercussions and consequences beyond what we can imagine or understand. Well, on November 17th, 2019, one of these butterfly effects, I think, really did happen. As far as we can tell, November 17th was the first somewhat official, unofficial reported human transmission of some type of respiratory disease, now known as COVID-19. November 17th in China. And it was amongst the first human-to-human transmission. Perhaps just one person, perhaps just a small handful of people have what we now know and is a global terror around the world. And now 6 months later, we have millions of confirmed cases around the world and likely hundreds of thousands of deaths. It's an uncomfortable reality, this tiny, minuscule event that happened about 6 months ago to where we are now. I think what's particularly chilling for me is we actually don't quite know how bad it is. We aren't even quite sure about our numbers. And I know you guys have probably been overloaded with numbers, but there's a couple of reasons we don't know our numbers. One thing we've learned about COVID-19 is that it's asymptomatic. That is, many people can have it and actually be completely unaware and show no signs of it as well. And because we have a finite, limited number of testing, we actually aren't able to test the entire population. And similarly, when people pass away, it's sometimes it can be difficult to know if they passed away of COVID-19 or some other reasons. When Italy was at its worst, a few of the Italian mayors actually tweeted that the death count is probably triple or quadruple the official number we see. So it is staggering. This butterfly effect of this tiny event that happened 6 months ago. And in Canada, I think we're still on the edge of our seat, having just crossed about 20,000 confirmed cases in our country, not counting the unconfirmed cases. A tiny microscopic event 6 months ago, now 6 months later, all around the world has a huge effect and consequences and repercussions. And that's why it's so important that we are doing this morning's worship through online streaming to practice our social distancing. And this is some of the ways we help uphold our country and protect the public safety and the public health of everyone. But today is Good Friday, and we face another uncomfortable reality. As we heard from this Bible reading, that for some reason all these people 2,000 years ago thought that what might seem like an insignificant event, something happening halfway across the world again, a simple man dying on the cross. But Christians throughout the years have said this is the greatest butterfly effect. A small event separated by thousands of years halfway around the world has a life-changing reality for you and I today. So let's talk a little bit about that. I think Good Friday is very much about uncomfortable realities. I think with COVID-19 for a while, I was overloaded with numbers, and so it was just a number. This number of people died. Oh, now 4 digits or 5 digits where people were dying every single day from COVID-19. And I kind of understood what that meant. Someone would get tested, find out they're positive. They would maybe go to the hospital. They would need to go to the ICU. And then we heard all about ventilators as one of the crucial healthcare tools to keep someone with COVID-19 alive and give them a chance at recovery. Let's talk a little bit about the uncomfortable reality beyond the numbers. What happens when one person dies from COVID-19? As you may know, COVID-19 is a respiratory disease. That is, it affects our breathing. It can cause severe pneumonia, where our lungs actually begin to fill with liquid. So there's something akin to drowning, the sensation of coronavirus, and you actually begin to become unable to breathe. And I don't know if any of you have experienced that, whether being on a ventilator. I had a bruised rib at one time where every breath you felt a little bit of pain. And ventilators then were the way to help people in these situations. And you might think that's wonderful, but being on a ventilator is a terrible, terrible experience as well, as tubes are inserted into your body. And some medical studies are realizing it's quite traumatic actually to be on a ventilator. And one of the really disconnecting experiences of being on a ventilator is you can't speak. So if you are on a ventilator for 7 days, even if 1 or 2 family members can visit you, which is severely restricted right now, you're unable to speak a word to your loved ones during that time of suffering. And you are struggling to breathe this entire time. So yes, a ventilator is a good thing, but it is also quite a traumatic, difficult experience. And in many countries that became overwhelmed with COVID-19, doctors faced a terrible situation. Perhaps on one hand, they had 20 patients that needed a ventilator, and only 10 units available. I wonder, in this time of global pandemic, do our hearts feel that reality, this uncomfortable reality, that this is what's happening around the world, even as we gather this morning? Our world is facing this global pandemic. What about the other uncomfortable reality that we are facing this morning, the reality of Good Friday? Do we also feel it? Are our hearts moved by this uncomfortable reality? In the book of Philippians in the Bible, it describes Jesus' death, and it says, "He," that is Jesus, "humbled himself and became obedient unto death, even death on a cross." Now, for you and I, we're not familiar with crucifixion or crosses, other than it being a religious symbol today. But the writer of Philippians, Paul, makes it very clear. Not only did Jesus die, he even died on a cross. Dying on a cross back in the Roman Empire was one of the lowest forms, one of the worst forms of punishment. It was never allowed to be done on Roman citizens. To give you a bit of an idea that even those who practiced crucifixion realized how horrible it was and decided this reality should never come true for one of our own. And as we heard in this account, we find out Jesus is betrayed, and at the beginning of our passage that he's flogged. When someone is flogged, they're stripped completely naked in front of a crowd, and soldiers take whips, and not just any ordinary whips with little bits of stone or things that are prickly attached to the whips so that they will tear flesh. And usually the victim is stripped naked so that the maximum damage can be done. And there'll be blood, sweat, and tears. During this, Jesus is also mocked. Mocked is not really a word we use. Perhaps it's more powerful if we think of Jesus being bullied by people striking him, yelling at him. He's given an unjust trial where the crowd turns against him. And then eventually he's ordered to carry his cross and then nailed to a cross and erected so that all those around can see him bleeding, his body and flesh already broken. Crucifixion is an awful, shameful way to die. And we hear even of the soldiers wondering, what should we do with his clothes? Of all the ways you could die, one pastor actually calls this is the most God-forsaken way to die. Not just to die in an ICU or quietly, to die on a cross publicly, shamed and abused, with blood and body fluids running down. I sometimes wonder if I was there, would I even be able to look at such a horror? Would I even be able to look? I imagine for many people perhaps walking by during the Roman Empire, to see someone on a cross would cause such an emotional reaction. I think many people would even shy their eyes away from seeing such a disgusting, horrible thing. So then why, when we face this uncomfortable reality, do we call it Good Friday? This morning when I went on Facebook, I saw our Archbishop Foley Beach already post something for Good Friday. And I read listened to his brief sharing and devotional, and he said one thing that stuck with me. He said, of all the things we know about the last week of Jesus' life, we know one thing: Jesus knows human pain. He knows our suffering. And I think that already gives us a bit of a hint into why we call it Good Friday, that Jesus already knows something of the human experience and has experienced the worst of the worst as well. Facing these uncomfortable realities is very much about facing the worst and the best, and perhaps we can go to the next slide. Well, with COVID-19, I think we've seen the worst and the best already. What's been awful is already in a global pandemic is seeing people abuse or exploit the situation. Some world leaders have already increased their power or found sneaky ways to sneak laws through, knowing that the people are distracted at this time. Just recently, a few U.S. senators were found to have dumped all their expensive stocks before the reality of coronavirus was announced, knowing that the stocks would drop greatly in price. Can you imagine that? Those we call public servants exploiting and making money, knowing that their fellow citizens would suffer, be sick, face financial and health ruin. Well, similar with the crucifixion, I think you see it brings out the worst in people. Whether in Pilate, whether in the crowd, whether in the soldiers, the people that mocked and bullied Jesus. These things can bring out the worst. Yet interestingly, sometimes we see amongst the worst also the best. I want to tell you the story of Dr. Roberto Stella. He is an Italian doctor. You may not know his name, but his story became a little bit famous. He died on March 11th, and he was actually the first doctor in Italy to succumb to coronavirus. He was already in his late 60s. And what happened to Dr. Stella, and as you know, Italy's healthcare system was completely overwhelmed by the coronavirus. Very quickly, certain hospitals ran out of what we call PPE, personal protective equipment. And Dr. Stella faced a challenging decision. He was running out of protective equipment to protect himself, yet he could see that all the ICU beds were full and they needed doctors badly. I imagine a man in his late 60s as a doctor probably could have faced a comfortable retirement, but instead he chose to be on the front line there. And even though, and you can imagine you go into your shift as a doctor and you see that the box of masks is empty or the box of sanitary gowns is empty, he chose to still serve his patients. As he did that, he eventually contracted the coronavirus and died, and Italians heralded him a hero, someone who didn't think selfishly, but even at great risk to himself, offered his services as a doctor. My heart was very moved when I heard the story. Pocha and I live about 2 blocks away from a hospital. And right now, as several of you may know, at 7 p.m., people go out on their balcony and they're banging their pots with anything that makes loud noise. Why? To cheer on and encourage our healthcare workers, knowing that just like Dr. Stella, they put themselves out there. They put themselves at risk. And I remember the first time I did it, I was like, we were wondering, what's that noise? And I realized it's the 7 p.m. thing. And I grabbed the pot, I grabbed the wooden spoon, ran out onto my balcony and started banging it very loudly. And my heart felt the surge of emotion. It's interesting, I think because we're doing all the social distancing, we actually have very little opportunities to be connected with a large group of people. And for me to hear other people clapping and cheering, I really felt the sense of love and sacrifice these healthcare workers had. And so I think we see the worst and the best. But Jesus' death is no ordinary death. Dr. Stella died, a tragic death. Many people have died. But Jesus' death, going back to a butterfly effect, has this effect, something that may have seemed insignificant thousands of years ago, halfway across the world, now affects us today. And I think the simple word I describe in our next point is simply the word redemption to understand this reality. Jesus' death is unlike any other. Let me paint an example. Let's pretend you and I, we're in line at Costco, and we're outside the Costco, as you've seen these lineups, doing our social distancing, and you're there for your groceries. And let's suppose there's a man standing behind you, and his phone rings. And because he has his phone volume very loud, you get to hear what that conversation is. And over the phone you hear, "Dear so-and-so, this is Vancouver General Hospital. We regret to inform you that your coronavirus test results have returned. They are in fact positive. You are highly contagious. You should immediately self-isolate." I want you to imagine you hear these words, and you are standing about 1 to 2 meters in front of this person. How would you feel? How would you feel in that moment? Thinking of yourself possibly getting sick, all your loved ones getting sick. What would you do? I think I'd want to run. I wonder, Canada's so polite, I wonder if I would want to lose my spot in line, but I think out of self-preservation, I would leave the line. I would leave the line immediately and hope this man would actually go self-isolate himself. I don't think I would want to hug him. I don't think I would want to give him a high five or shake his hand or embrace him. I think I would want to keep the maximum amount of distance between us. The difference between me and Jesus cannot be more stark. One of the ways we can understand the spiritual redemption that comes when we think of Good Friday is that Jesus sees our whole world, and it is a world broken, and perhaps a better word is infected with sin, with corruption, with selfishness, our infirmities, our sicknesses, our injustice, and our ignorance. And Jesus does something different than I would do. He doesn't distance himself. He embraces it. He, in fact, hugs the world, if you will. I know it's almost an impossible exercise, but imagine everything that is wrong with the world throughout time, throughout history, and Jesus carries it on his shoulders to the cross. That is the reality of Good Friday. That as Jesus' arms are stretched out on the cross, there are actually arms that are open to also embrace our world. And so in our service, we pray, Lamb of God, you take away the sin of the world. But we pray that knowing that Jesus, in fact, took the sin on his shoulders as well. And that's why we call it Good Friday. The terrible reality of this awful, gruesome, shameful death, yet God turns it into redemption. One of our fellow priests in our denomination wrote this article in Christianity Today, and it helped connect to both the coronavirus and Good Friday, something I'm attempting to do in this sermon as well. And she writes this is by Andrea Tish Warren. God did not sick coronavirus on us to teach us a lesson, nor does he delight in the chaos and death it is causing. God hates sickness and death, but God also lets no crisis, no suffering, and nothing in our lives go to waste. God is resourceful and takes it all as a raw material for redemption. The horror of what happened at the cross, God the Father turns it into raw material for our redemption. This year, our Good Friday comes in the midst of this global pandemic. Do you know that God is still redeeming the world? That nothing is wasted, and God can turn the awful into the good. And I hope that image helps. And in the way we would want to run from an infected COVID-19 patient, Jesus runs towards and embraces our world, our infected world of sin. Well, finally, as I close, I wonder if the patients of Dr. Roberto Stella, I wonder if they knew what their doctor did. I wonder if they, when they're in the ventilator, if they opened their eyes and saw this doctor, perhaps without a mask, perhaps without protective equipment, I think they would have been very moved to know his sacrifice. And today I ask you, as we gather in this worship service to meet Jesus, do you know? Do you know what Jesus did for you? Do you know what happened when Christ took upon himself and on his shoulders my sin, your sin, my infection of sin, your infection of sin? All the corruption, evil, and greed in our world was lifted upon the cross for you and I. The great hymn, When I Survey the Wondrous Cross, describes it this way: sorrow and love flow mingled down. Brothers and sisters, may we feel that today. The great sorrow of seeing the shameful, gruesome death of Christ. That sorrow flows down, yet it doesn't flow alone. With it flows the very love of Christ, the good love, his rich love, his steadfast love flows upon you and I today. Amen.